Greetings, friends, all over the world where you are linking into this wonderful conference that we are going to have here. Thank you to the Upper Room for organizing this important conference at a time such as this. A conference that is about resilience and how we build it and to increase also our hope at this time. We come to this sacred and spiritual gathering to seek for ourselves and those that we love and care for spiritual resources for the healing of the huge level of pain and trauma that exists in the world at this time. We gather here in the words of a South African musical group Stimela song titled, "We are all tributaries of the great river of pain." We are all tributaries of the great river of pain flowing into one ocean. There is only one ocean, all our pain flowing into it. But it did spill over the wonders of love into one nation of love before we recognize that all the oceans are one. Don't be afraid. Don't whisper in the deep. Speak up your mind. Stand up. Those are the wonderful words of the song. Indeed, we gather during this weekend, all of us, wherever we are meeting, as tributaries of the great river of suffering, river of pain and trauma. We are gathered here to recognize that the great river of human pain and trauma flow into one ocean. Our pain and trauma flow from and into different parts of the world. They flow into a common place, but because we are a common race called humanity. My brief from the organizers of this gathering is that I reflect on the long journey of healing. My suspicion is that the organizers are aware that there are incidents of suffering and of pain whose healing may happen instantly and at particular moments. They also recognize that there is, however, the amount of trauma that require a long journey of healing. The focus and emphasis of my presentation is more on the collective intergenerational pain and trauma that is based more on violent histories. Trauma is a very complex and a multi-layered phenomenon. The world is full of people who have experienced all kinds of pain and all kinds of trauma. There are those who have gone through individual or personal, and those who know collective traumas. There are those of us whose experience of trauma is a long journey of intergenerational woundedness. There are certain historical traumas that have come through such experience, and most of them are violent in nature. Whether you talk the experiences of genocide, as we saw in Namibia with Germans, as we saw in Rwanda when the Hutus murdered almost 1 million of Tutsis, while the world and the United Nations in particular just watched. Whether you talk the experience of trauma through the transatlantic slavery, the consequent trauma of which is still with Africans the world over. Whether you talk world and imperial wars where powerful nations manipulated by the military-industrial complex, motivated by greed, go all out to export wars to other countries. Whether you talk the international terrorism that we have experienced with the September 11 tragedy, whether it was the Paris attack in 2015 and the Nairobi attack in 2013. As we gather here, the world is also under the grip of the coronavirus, whose impact on the human race has brought so much suffering, so much pain and trauma. And these are all the time almost violent. We gather here to seek for ourselves and the world ways of building resilience. How do we build mechanisms of endurance? How do we ensure that we are able to cope? Reflecting on the trauma that the black South Africans have gone through due to the evil and violent system of apartheid, I draw from the work of two fellow eminent South Africans. One is a seasoned academic and the other a seasoned activist and practitioner in the field of trauma and healing. Professor Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela is an academic at the University of Stellenbosch and a clinical psychologist who was responsible at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for providing psychosocial support for both perpetrators and victims of the state-sponsored violence. We have, through her work, come to know that the healing of trauma is never totally a realized goal. She tells us that trauma and healing is an ongoing journey which is progressively realized one day at a time. That when we talk of trauma, we must be prepared to go into that journey. Gobodo-Madikizela has argued that if not adequately attended to and comprehensively addressed, wounds will lead to intergenerational and ongoing cycles of repeated acts of traumatizing violence. On the other hand, we have Father Michael Lepsley, an Anglican priest who was chaplain of the South African Liberation Movement, the African National Congress, who was exiled in Zimbabwe. He was a victim, or a survivor rather, as he would prefer to be viewed, of a letter bomb that the apartheid security operatives sent to him while he was in exile. Father Lepsley had his hands destroyed by the shrapnel from the bomb, had his eyes injured to the point of almost total blindness. He has since established the Center for the Healing of Memories based in Cape Town that is doing work assisting victims and survivors of violent traumas in the world. The Healing of Memories program is an intentional process designed to disrupt the effects of brokenness and the cycle of violence, and ensuring that it is not passed from generation to generation. This process includes the creation of safe spaces and circles of trust where people come together to be healers of each other as they listen to each other's stories, because there is power when we deal with trauma in storytelling. They also use tools and rituals that bring healing to those who have been impacted by trauma. In all this work that these fellow South Africans do, the African spirituality and philosophical ethic of Ubuntu is a powerful resource in mediating and cultivating inner resilience to sustain individuals and communities against all kinds of trauma. Ubuntu is about learning to be fully human together. We are, through Ubuntu, able to recognize, to respect the divine in each and every human being. We become a collective resource and communal source of resilience to each other. And so in the African context, community is a resource. Each human being has what Africans in the Zulu and Sesotho language call isitunzi or siriti, which is literally translated a shadow. But more than just being a physical, literal shadow, it is more about dignity. African spirituality tells us, as you can see, that when I stand here and there's light shining on me, there is a shadow that you will see. This shadow accompanies me, whether I am under the light or not. It is part of me. It is an intrinsic part of me. The shadow of a filthy rich person and that of a poor are but the same. Sometimes we may not see the shadow, but we know that it is there. All that you need to do, it is to shine light upon the object, and you will be able to see the shadow. This is what we learn about dignity. That dignity has got nothing to do with who we are. And therefore, these values of Ubuntu and African spirituality become what sustain and carry us through times of adversity and tragedy. We know that we have each other. I want to talk about, in trying to point out about resilience, to learn and borrow from the story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible. In that story, Luke records the challenge of the unsafe and dangerous Jericho Road. It was full of robbers who regularly hurt, traumatized, and murdered people. In this particular instance in the story, there is this nameless victim who was just an individual example from what could be a sample of many such victims on the Jericho Road. The Samaritan came and intervened through a personalized pastoral ministry. The Bible and Luke records for us that he dressed the wounds of the victim and transferred him for ongoing nursing at a nearby facility. Friends, noble as this act is, it cannot be considered a sustainable way of building resilience. We need to read this text and probe deeper. And therefore, the long journey of healing of trauma calls on the church to be involved in preventative ministries that ensure that there is no inflicting of pain and trauma by one group or one nation by another. Struggles for freedom, whether we talk struggles against racism, against patriarchy and misogyny, against homophobia, all these things that bring trauma on people in the world and others. When we do that, we must be prepared to go into long journeys of collective resilience that is marked by initiatives of protest and resistance. Because trauma is always brought upon people by evil acts. And if we want to transform this world, we must be prepared to do that. May I remind us that Christianity is a faith that was born out of a violent, traumatic experience. You see, the crucifixion of Christ on Mount Calvary was more than a violence against an individual. It was a state-sponsored extrajudicial murder by the imperialist Roman Empire of Caesar. It was a systemic conspiracy of an unholy alliance of the powerful religio-political structures represented by Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, and Herod. Christianity is not a popcorn religion and junk spirituality that is immune to suffering, like many have come to make of it. We who are followers of Christ are of a resilient faith that is born out of a struggling and suffering God. This weak and vulnerable God is the one that was presented to us by the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann in the title of his book, The Crucified God. We worship a God who was crucified and murdered and experienced trauma. We are born out of trauma. The healing power of the cross is articulated by the father of black theology, the late James Cone, in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in which he compares the symbol of the cross on which Christ was executed with the tree on which black slaves were hanged, were lynched, and tortured to death. The cross, writes Cone, is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with a new hope that comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word. That is how we as Christians build our resilience. Christ's death was a life-giving death. Christ's death and resurrection is a resource for Christian resilience. The missional call to the church is to engage in resurrection ministries to people who have experienced violent and traumatizing crucifixions in their lives, because there are people who are on a daily basis experiencing their own crucifixions. We need, as believers, to engage people in ongoing ministries that offer opportunities of resurrection. Because at the heart of the resurrection is hope. Hope that is not empty, paralyzing optimism, but one that is anchored in faith and conviction that things must change. Linda Vogel, in her Upper Room published book titled Rituals of Resurrection, Celebrating Life and Death, speak of rituals of resurrection. That we as the church have on a daily basis meet people who are going through pain, who are going through grief, who are going through trauma, and we must offer them interventions and resurrections and rituals of resurrection. And so in conclusion, I want to say, in my own understanding, if we need to build resilience, we need to understand that it is a continuum of three things. Number one, it is about healing. Healing that focuses on the post-event, when the hurt and the wounds have happened, and we build and we come and we heal those. And resilience. Resilience is helping people in the present so that they can be able to cope, they are able to endure, they are able to bounce back. But there is the third one that is driven by an understanding of justice. It is making sure that we prevent that there be no further traumas in the world, that we create a world through acts of justice, standing for the truth and campaigning for human rights so that we do not experience any further traumas. We can't just help and concentrate on helping people to cope. This, my dear brothers and sisters, wherever you are in the world, I offer to you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.